Good evening, everyone. My name is David Elwood. I'm the dean here at Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government. And welcome to the John F. Kennedy's Junior Forum. It's my special honor tonight to introduce tonight's lecture. It's an honor for two reasons. First, it's an honor because it is the Malcolm Weiner Lecture. Now, Malcolm Weiner Lecture was established in 1989, and it reflects the donor's interests in scholarship in issues around international financial matters, currency systems, and international monetary systems. And we've had some remarkable speakers ranging from Pete Peterson to Muhammad Yunus on this stage. And tonight we continue on. My second honor, of course, is because of the person that I'm going to be introducing. But let me say a few words about Malcolm Weiner, who's someone I know quite well. Interestingly enough, when I first became a professor here at the Kennedy School, I was a Malcolm Weiner professor. So I feel a special affinity to this man who was unable to join us tonight. But what's striking about him is he is someone who has ranged very broadly. He has done work in the financial services sector. He also has spent time in doing a set of issues that involve social policy, ranging from criminal justice to employment and training policy. And indeed, he provided the support for the Malcolm Weiner Center for Social Policy, one of our most important centers here at the school, which covers issues of poverty, social policy, and the like. Interestingly enough, though, he truly is a Renaissance man in many ways. Indeed, currently, in some ways, his best-known work is on issues of Aegean civilizations, ranging from Minoan Crete to Mycenaean Greece and Kyklades in the Bronze Age, and the interrelationships, and indeed much of his focus now and some of his philanthropy. He's both a very serious scholar and a philanthropist on issues of dating. It turns out one of the most critical questions that you have to ask is, what came before what? When you discover two little fragments of pottery, knowing that the answer to that question can tell you a great deal about the people and the civilizations and where they came from, what they're doing. So it is in that remarkable footprint and shadow that we have tonight's Malcolm Weiner Lecture. And our speaker tonight is himself someone who is both a visionary and who has crossed many different boundaries and continues to be engaged in various ways. Indeed, we have before us a speaker who has been the president of Shell Oil Company based in Houston, and also the chairman of the National Urban League, which does issues particularly around people of color around the country, especially in urban areas and the like. He was the president of Shell Oil Company until July of 2008, a word or two about that. But now, much of his time and energy, indeed, near as I can tell, all of his waking energy, is focused on a new not-for-profit nationwide membership organization called Citizens for Affordable Energy. I'm not going to say too much about that. I'm sure he'll tell us a few words himself, but it is an educational group designed to help Americans and presumably people around the world to understand the challenges of energy supply, sustainable environmental policy, public education on energy issues, and a whole host of other kinds of things. Now, Mr. Hoffmeister was named president of Shell Oil Company in Houston, heading the U.S. In March 2005, and headed the U.S. country leadership team, which included leaders of Shell businesses throughout the United States. He became head of the group Human Resource Director after serving as Human Resource Director of the Shell Group based in The Hague in the Netherlands. As Shell president, he did extensive outreach, and in some respects, his current work is a reflection of something that clearly happened that he was quite involved in throughout. For example, he was part of an 18-month, 50-city tour across the United States in which Hoffmeister led 250 other Shell leaders to meet more than 15,000 business, community, and civic leaders, policymakers, in thinking about how do we deal with energy and the like. And the truth is, the really inconvenient truth about energy and the environment is it's complicated, not simple, and it's expensive and not cheap. And so part of what Mr. Hoffmeister has been trying to do is help us think and educate the country and the world about these kinds of issues. He's held leadership positions in many other places, ranging from General Electric to Nortel and Allied Signal. He's also a member of the U.S. Department of Energy's Hydrogen and Fuel Cell Technical Advisory Committee. So he serves on many boards, foreign policy associations and the like, but you didn't come here to hear me talk. So without further ado, let me turn to tonight's Malcolm Wiener speaker, John Hoffmeister. But before doing that, I neglected to mention one other thing. The Kennedy School has a fairly long now, or growing, association with Shell Oil Company, and they've been remarkably supportive in our efforts to look at energy and environmental issues and provide, again, more insights and more ideas and more ideals. They've also been helpful, as some of you may know, in our efforts to help New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. After Hurricane Katrina, this was a moment of particular pride for us. A great number of our students, as well as students from other parts of the university, went down and provided what, by all accounts, was really critical service to one of the main neighborhoods within New Orleans. That work was heavily supported by Shell Oil Company, for which we are also grateful. So without further ado, please welcome John Hoffmeister.
Dean Edelman, thank you very much for that introduction. It is an honor to be here this evening, ladies and gentlemen, and the research that I've been able to do on Malcolm Wiener is most impressive. We have a dilemma in our country which we are not dealing with very effectively. And I can introduce it by telling you a story. Every year in June, during my time as president of Shell Oil Company, I would get a letter from former Congressman Joe Kennedy, Jr., who would send me a letter in Houston and say, Mr. Hoffmeister, what are you going to do in the coming heating oil season this fall to help the low and fixed income people in the Massachusetts area cope with high heating oil prices? He would promise to call. We would exchange pleasantries, and I would say, Congressman, the best that I can do for you is to have my whole company work as hard as it knows how to get full funding for LIHEAP. He said, you mean you're not going to give us discounted oil? I said, Congressman, if I gave it to your community, but didn't give it to every other community that asked, I would be hurting my company's interests big time. I hope you'll understand. I realize the problem. The problem can be addressed with full funding of LIHEAP, which has gone for years with partial funding. And I pledge to do everything that I can do to see that it's fully funded. Well, the good news is the stimulus plan fully funds LIHEAP for the first time in a long time. But the price of heating oil, as you well know, has come down to remarkably low levels in the course of the last 6 or 8 months. But the high price of heating oil will return. As sure as we're sitting here, it will return. I'll talk about that in a little bit. But let me just ask if you have ever been bone cold to the point that you are barely able to walk or stand. And then all the coats, the hats, the scarves, in a cold house, in a cold winter, without heating fuel, it is life-threatening, and people do die. Have you ever been in the Deep South on a hot, sultry summer evening where the humidity in the air, and particularly if you're a baby or if you're an elderly person, you're a walking zombie because of the pain and the difficulty of breathing without air conditioning? LIHEAP was designed to help low and fixed income people with those issues. These are life-threatening issues that tie back to the cost of energy and how affordable that energy is. But what is going on in a society that ostensibly is so well-to-do that yet tens of thousands of our citizens every winter and every summer face either the frigid cold or the stifling heat, and they have to make choices between their personal well-being, their health, and whether they're eating or whether they will be otherwise dispossessed in some way because of the loss of disposable income. What's going on that over a period of decades, this country has been unable to solve its energy supply issues or to come to grips with the technologies around energy which makes energy more efficient? What is it that we're missing as a society, as a collection of 300+ million intelligent people that can't figure this out? Just 1 year ago, we were facing the crisis of so-called pain at the pump, which the media blamed on the excessive profits of the oil companies, which sanctimonious politicians claimed on the greed of oil executives. I know because I was called to testify on multiple occasions, including the infamous question, how did you get to Washington? Well, I took Amtrak. I wasn't so unpolished in how I traveled to Washington, D.C., not by corporate jet, but by Amtrak from New York. I was also asked how much I make in front of cameras, which were on C-SPAN. So my mother got to know how much I make. And it was the embarrassment of one of the executives who didn't remember how much he made, which really made the news that night, not my salary. But the venom and the mindset that promotes such venomous behavior in terms of how energy executives or how political figures or how media represent to their stakeholder groups the dilemma of energy supply, energy price, energy availability is something we have yet to come to grips with. The bankers are in the spotlight today, the oil executives a year ago. People said it was speculation that took oil to $140-something a barrel. It wasn't. It was demand-driven. It was demand-driven by diesel and aviation fuel, of which only a certain amount can be produced per barrel of oil. And there was a limit as to the number of barrels of oil production per day, which had been capped for about 4 years at about 85 million barrels a day. And as China prepared for the Olympics and as the air travel industry grew and grew with low-cost fares, the demand for diesel and aviation fuel was unrelenting. It was only when it finally reached the $140 mark that the airlines said, enough. They threw in their hat. And they started to cut back on flights because they couldn't make profit, couldn't even make margin on the price of fuel. And it was the unpredictability along with the shortages of availability which caused them to throw in the towel. And it was the ability of the Chinese to pull off the Olympics without having to shut down coal-fired power plants, therefore using up all that diesel, which they'd been buying for months and months, which prompted a surplus of diesel to be around. When the oil price was 130 and I was testifying in Congress, I knew and I said we were storing gasoline because demand had been broken at about the 390 level. Americans changed their driving habits at that price level, and from about March of last year, right up through the summer, when the prices started to really come down, late summer, Americans were using less and less gasoline. But here's an irony. In February of 2008 and February of 2009, guess what? Americans drove roughly the same amount of mileage. And they used all of the fuel that could be produced in that month. So demand stopped shrinking in February 2009 because of what? Low prices. People like the low prices. So these are some backdrop stories to kind of set the stage. What's going on in the energy industry? What's going on in our government-led energy policies, which since 1973, when President Nixon came on national television 4 weeks after the beginning of the Arab oil embargo and asked Americans to turn off their Christmas lights to save energy, but at the same time announced boldly his plan for energy independence in America within 7 years, so that we were no longer at the mercy of foreign governments, foreign oil ministries, which would some way or another withhold their oil from our markets. 8 presidents later, every administration has in one way or another pledged to promote or to deliver energy independence. The election of 2008 was no different. Both candidates stood for energy independence in America. During that time, we've had 18 Congresses. 18 separate Congresses have each had the opportunity to work on energy policy. In 2005, in 2006, in 2007, and yes, 2008, we had energy bills passed by the respective Congresses. Now in 7 and 8, they reversed some of what was passed in 2005 and 6. There was a different leadership. A different party was in the majority. That, in fact, is part of the problem. And I'm here to say we will not fix our energy futures. We will not deal adequately with our environmental sustainability requirements as long as we let the current system try to manage our way forward. Let me explain what I mean. If 8 administrations and 18 Congresses can't do the job, what's to suggest that the current Congress and the current president can do the job? Well, he's new, he's different. Well, so were the previous 7. And I don't doubt the competence of every one of them because they were chosen by the American people. Nor do I doubt the competence of at least the elected officials that I've known in my adult life. They're all pretty competent. So what is it about competent people fully committed to their careers, to their country, that don't enable them to solve the problem? Here's the crux of it. Solving energy issues in political time, in political ways, cannot succeed. If 35 years is not enough evidence, how much more do we need? The volatility of the price. Now we're at $48 today, 47 and something today for the oil price versus 140 9 months ago. We could be at $200 in 2011, 2012, just in time for the next presidential election. And I did say to candidate Obama, in preparing for his run, as I offered to each of the presidential candidates one way or another, my advice. And my advice was, Senator, it is not the price of gasoline when you're running for election that matters. It's the price of gasoline when you're running for re-election that really matters. And my concern about your program thus far is you don't have a hydrocarbon agenda. You have a biofuels agenda and an alternative renewable energy agenda, which is fine, but what's your hydrocarbon agenda? Because if the nation doesn't tap into its domestic hydrocarbon resources and continues to rely on exports or imports to this country for its supply, when we are at the mercy of those oil exporting countries, unless we change our own approach to hydrocarbons. And the plug-in hybrids that you're proposing are also fine. But if we have 1 million on the road by 2016, as you suggest, that's great. That's 1 million cars that we didn't have before. But the 250 million cars that are already on the road and which will be replaced by gasoline engines over the course of the next 5 or 6 years will only use gasoline. Or if they're flex fuel vehicles, they can use E85, but there won't be enough E85 to go around because it takes too long to make the biofuels. So there is something called political time, defined as every 2 years or every 4 years, depends how you're counting and which elections you're looking to. 2-year and 4-year cycles are natural to our political process. And I think we as citizens appreciate the opportunity to choose our elected officials and our government and their priorities every 2 years and 4 years. It makes a lot of sense. But when it comes to energy, there is something called energy time, which transpires in decades. It takes decades to imagine, to plan, to engineer, to permit, to build, to construct, to operate, and then ultimately decommission a major energy project. 30 to 40 years, sometimes even longer. Over that 30 to 40-year time period, investors in energy projects want certainty. So energy companies, whether they're utilities, whether they're gas and oil companies, whatever big investments they're going to make, they need investment certainty. And when there is uncertainty, they don't invest. And when we zigzag our political priorities every 2 years or 4 years, it becomes very problematic to build an investment profile that enables companies, private investors, to put their money forward. We've held back wind developments in this country, unfortunately, for a decade. Why? Because Congress could only see its way to approve the reinvestment, the tax credits for wind farms for a maximum of 2 years. And occasionally it was 1 year. Well, big investors in wind farms aren't going to operate on the basis that their investment could be in the hundreds of millions, could be in the billions of a wind farm. The tax credit's only guaranteed for a year. And the financials of such an investment depend on that tax credit because wind is not yet profitable in the classic sense. So for political purposes, we've held back because no one wanted to commit tax credits longer than a 2-year cycle. Now, fortunately, in the current thinking of Congress, there will be a 10-year tax credit, which is so much better. And that will help with wind farms and solar farms. But political time and energy time are mutually contradictory. They are water and oil, which we know don't mix. And that has been the case for 35 years. But wait, if you think I'm talking negatively, I haven't finished yet. There are a number of negative aspects which I need to inform you about from my point of view before I offer positive, encouraging, optimistic plans for the future. Because I wouldn't be here if I didn't think we could solve this problem in material ways and solve it in a reasonable time frame. But you got to know how bad it is. Political partisanship adds to the burden, adds to the difficulty, because political partisanship plays out in political time. And if you look at our current state of affairs as a nation when it comes to energy and the environment, we are at the opposite end of a bell-shaped curve. A bell-shaped curve says most of the people are concentrated in the middle. Most of the opinions are concentrated in the middle. Well, we are a U-shaped curve. Rather than a bell curve, we're a U-shaped curve where at the top of the U, we have the right and the left busily shouting at each other over energy solutions or environmental solutions because they are ideologically driven. And if we try to solve our problems ideologically in the energy space and in the environmental space, we will never succeed because all the people are down here at the bottom of the U watching this behavior play out at the top of the U, where the right and the left are simply on a different page when it comes to solutions in this area. The drill baby drill crowd, as we saw the chanting at the Republican convention this past summer, will bring their drill right into your backyard and put it right over the top of your swimming pool if you let them. They are so anxious to drill anytime, anywhere, which I don't think, while it may be ideologically interesting, it's not a sound energy policy. Meanwhile, on the other side, the no more hydrocarbon in 10 years crowd, I'm not sure the gears are working up here. Because to say that no more hydrocarbon in 10 years is to completely miss how deeply embedded hydrocarbons are in our national infrastructure. And there is no conceivable way to extract that embedding of hydrocarbons into our transportation or our electricity production in not just one decade, but many decades, unless we simply want to turn off the lights and turn off our air conditioners at the same time. And to say messages like that is simply ideological stamping, and ideology doesn't solve the problem. But it's still worse than partisan politics. Our federal government is structured dysfunctionally for energy solutions. And here's what I mean. When you're facing fundamental structural dysfunction, it means you can't get things done because you have contradictions that oppose what you're trying to do. Many Americans believe that the Department of Energy governs energy in our country. Would that it was that simple. The Department of Energy is one of 13 executive branch agencies that govern energy and the environment. 13 separately chartered. No matter how well led, the charters are intending to do different things. So if you are an integrated oil major and you're attempting to drill for oil, you can get one set of responses from the Interior Department, which is working on your onshore leases, a completely different response from the Department of Commerce, in which the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration sits, which controls the minerals, the permitting process for the offshore oil drilling. And those two departments don't necessarily have to coordinate or be integrated in the way in which they view what you're trying to do. But those are two of the 13. If the executive, and plus the White House, and the White House usually has something to say on these matters as well. And with the appointment of an energy and climate czar, I'm sure Carol Browner will do her best to do what she believes is right for her role, but it just adds to the complexity of the executive branch. But now let's move over to the legislative branch. You might think that the House Energy Committee and the Senate Energy Committee govern energy. Well, they do. And every 2 years, their chairman could change, and have. We just saw Dingell give way to Waxman in the House. Domenici just gave way to Bingaman in the Senate. And as the chairmans change, so do the priorities, so do the objectives. But wish it were that simple. Instead, we're dealing with 26 congressional committees and subcommittees that govern energy and the environment in one way or another, and all 26 of those chairs could change after any election. So with the legislative fragmentation, with the executive branch fragmentation, isn't that bad enough? Well, we have an independent judiciary as well. And any two parties can bring a case forward to a federal bench on an interpretation or on an application of any energy law, and that bench can establish what the case will be, what the interpretation or what the rule shall be. And if you're in a major integrated oil company, you are in court all the time. You are facing judicial inquiry or judicial cases, one after the other, on any proposed new project as well as the disposition of existing projects which somebody comes along and wants to challenge. And it could be for any reason. And it could be your competitor who's challenging you. So the judicial branch has a role, the legislative branch has a role, and the executive branch has a role. But all added up together, it explains why in 35 years we've gone from importing 30% of our oil to importing last year nearly 70% of our oil. We've gone backwards in terms of the commitment to energy independence, and we haven't fixed the problem at all. And the chances are, in 2-year cycles, it will not be fixed. So what do we do? What do we do as Americans, as citizens, as thoughtful, intelligent people? Well, the reason I founded Citizens for Affordable Energy was to go at it a very different way. Before I say this, let me just say, well, why doesn't the industry solve the problem? Why doesn't the energy industry solve the problem? Well, for the very same reason that the federal government is incapable. The industry is so fragmented as an industry that each part of the industry looks out for its own self-interests and the interests of its shareholders, which it is essentially required to do under the fiduciary duties and responsibilities of the board of directors of those companies. And so you have oil and gas companies who don't have any interest in what coal or clean coal looks like, or what renewable or alternative energies looks like. You have biofuels industries now competing with oil industries. You have wind and solar competing against each other for government incentives. You have a nuclear industry. Within the electric utility industry, you have the coal crowd, the nuclear crowd, the hydropower crowd, and they don't necessarily have common interest. So they work in the interests of themselves, which is why they haven't solved the problems. So the reason for founding Citizens for Affordable Energy is to go at it a very different way, to go right at the citizens of this country who are deeply impacted. The social injustice, the social inequity that comes about in this country from high energy prices, from the volatility of energy availability and price, something has to be done outside the system. And so the purpose of building an organization of grassroots Americans in all 50 states, and yes, outside this country because other citizens have the same issue, is to get at the solutions. And here are the solutions that people can get their heads around. There are 6. Number 1, we need more energy from all supplies. That's just a given. There is no silver bullet, you've heard that before. There's no single approach which will fix our energy future. We need it all. We need more hydrocarbon, particularly in the short term. Short term in energy speak is 10 years, 0 to 10 years. And so in the next 10 years, we need more hydrocarbons because the other alternatives will not satisfy either our growth or our replacement requirements. And so if we don't have a plan for more hydrocarbons in the 0 to 10 period, we're going to be short and it's going to be very expensive. We then need other plans for the 10 to 20 year period, which is medium term. And we need further plans for the 25 years and out period, which is long term in energy speak. So we need more energy from all sources if we're going to meet the economic growth requirements of the country. The Energy Department predicts that energy demand will double by 2030 globally, and there are some who would suggest it could even treble. In this country, we can expect a 50% increase in energy demand between now and 2030. And we have just been standing still for all practical purposes. And that's what drove the prices a year ago. We're standing still. Secondly, we need to make big decisions, hard decisions, on those technologies which will really drive efficiency in the use of energy. The big decisions, such as, why do we continue to invest in a 100-year-old product that is at best 20% efficient? And that's the internal combustion engine. The internal combustion engine, which only runs on liquid fuels, is 100+ years old and it's 20% efficient. Can't we do better with technology choices than that kind of inefficient old instrument to meet our personal mobility requirements? Light bulbs, fortunately in 2008, the Congress took a look at light bulbs. The incandescent light bulb, which Thomas Edison invented and is still being used by most of us, 3% efficiency in the use of electricity for light. 97% wasted as heat. Well, fortunately, under the law, we will be abandoning those light bulbs in the coming years. Big technology choices like hydrogen fuel cell, big technology choices like more nuclear power, where the technologies involved all carry certain risks, all carry certain issues associated with them, but we can make better technology choices for the efficient use of energy. Nuclear energy produces at 2 million times per energy unit what hydrocarbons produce. 2 million times what hydrocarbons produce. We burn a train carload of coal every 3 seconds in this country. If you do the math, that's 1,200 train car loads full of coal every hour. We're using 10,000 gallons of oil a second in this country. We're using 60 billion cubic feet of natural gas a day. If you stack those cubic feet on top of each other, we're looking at building a tower from here to the moon and back 25 times every day. That's the size of the quantity of energy that we're consuming today, times 50% more by 2030. If we continue on our current technology course, I hate to think what it will be like in terms of the atmosphere. So the third solution is, how are we going to manage carbon? How are we going to manage gaseous waste? Nobody in our society willingly or knowingly puts their head over a smokestack. Nobody knowingly or willingly stands behind a bus for an extended period of time to breathe the fumes. Why? They're dangerous. They're, in many cases, toxic or fatal. But yet we're pouring that trash into the atmosphere every day, and it's growing. And while we're debating at a U-shaped curve level between is there or isn't there climate change, is there or isn't there global warming, and intelligent people live on both sides of the U, and they end up arguing with each other over the is or the isn't question, while we're pouring more waste into the atmosphere. It's time to change the conversation. I say set climate change and global warming conversation on the bench, and let's play on the field of controlling gaseous waste. We have controlled physical waste or we'd be buried in it, and we don't ask how much it costs. We'd be dead if we weren't managing liquid waste because we'd be drinking poisonous water. We have managed as a society to deal with physical waste. We've managed as a society to deal with liquid waste. What is so difficult about coming to grips with gaseous waste? Is it because we can't see it, that it doesn't exist? Well, it does exist. We breathe it every day. And over the course of time, people die young. And in some countries around the world, they die very young with the gaseous waste emitted into the atmosphere. But it's because we're choosing the wrong thing to discuss, we end up in an ideological debate which gets us nowhere. And so how we manage gaseous waste is critical to how we move forward. I've long been on record as advocating a cap-and-trade system versus a carbon tax because it's my belief that human ingenuity will be propelled forward by the creative, value-creating opportunities of cap-and-trade, whereas a carbon tax is simply carrying a bag of rocks around on your back, and you're weighed down by the heaviness of that tax. Whereas those who are winners and those who are smarter than others will make money off cap-and-trade. And that will incentivize more people to apply their intelligence, their human capacity to gaseous waste solutions. The fourth solution is we must have new infrastructure, better, smarter infrastructure to move energy from where it's produced to where it's consumed. Today we are operating under 1930s legislation in many cases with respect to how infrastructure is built. For example, the President's idea of building huge transmission line corridors to take alternative wind energy from the Rocky Mountains east or west to the two coasts. It is a good idea. It's a right idea. It will help our energy demand in the future. But states govern transmission lines. There isn't a federal authority to manage the transmission lines on an interstate basis unless we change the laws. But that goes right up against states' rights, doesn't it? And there will be a pushback from states who say, no, we manage transmission lines. And if the federal government tries to take over our transmission line authorities, you're in for a fight. Now, some states may cooperate, some may not. Some governors will accept stimulus money, some governors will not. There we are, back into politics and the political time when we need energy time solutions. But we must have new and replacement infrastructure, and we're up against the individual not in my backyard problem. I spent years arguing on behalf of a liquefied natural gas regasification terminal to be built not in anybody's backyard, but instead to be built 12 miles off the shore of Long Island. And I think 11 miles off the shore of Connecticut, or I got the states reversed, 11 of one and 12 of the other. Not in anybody's backyard. But the governor of Connecticut and the governor of New York said, no, we don't want this anywhere near us. Take it to Rhode Island. In Connecticut, they said, take it to Massachusetts. That is not going to build new infrastructure. That's a very serious issue for this country to come to grips with. Where are we going to build the next refinery? Where are we going to build the regasification terminals? Where are we going to put the transmission towers to move that wind energy from the Rockies to where people live? It's not simple. So there's 4 solutions to start with. More energy, technology, carbon management, and infrastructure. Now it gets tricky. The 5th recommendation is not without precedent, but in the energy space, it is profound. And the suggestion is to create a federal independent regulatory agency called the Federal Energy Resources Board by an act of Congress signed by the President to take energy and the regulation of energy and the management of energy and the atmosphere away from Congress, away from the White House, and give those authorities to a federal energy independent agency. In the manner in which we've managed money for 95 years, and while we're having some problems with money at the moment, it is not because of the Fed and the decisions they've made, it's because of abuses of what the Fed allowed to occur. But for 95 years, the United States of America has had the most stable monetary system in the world, bar none. In terms of the authorities of the Fed, they manage the money supply, they manage the interest rate, they manage the open market window, and they have the right of intervention in institutions that pose a financial risk to the country. There are a board of governors, subject matter experts, appointed in a democratic fashion by the President with advice and consent from the Senate. They serve 7-year terms, which means they serve beyond the term of a single Congress, beyond the term of a single president, if it's a one-term president. They may be reappointed, they may not be reappointed as governors, but they operate independent of the political mood of the moment. They operate independent and are accountable to society, to the American people, for doing what's right for the good of the nation. And in a Federal Energy Resources Board, they can have areas of 4 responsibilities, 4 commanding heights of energy. One is to manage the short, medium, and long-term supply side. What areas of energy supply will we encourage or discourage over time? If we're 20% nuclear today, and the considered view of the Federal Energy Resources Board is we should be at 30% or 40% by 2050, they can provide the enablers that enable us to double the size of the nuclear plant fleet in this country. If they decide we need more domestic hydrocarbon production in the course of the next decade or 2, then that decision can be made and an enabler is put in place. So on the supply side, they can manage the future. They can also manage the carbon footprint. They can set the cap. They can set the parameters around how that cap is ever reduced without Congress, one Congress saying this cap, the next Congress, which is controlled by another party, saying, no, we're not going to do that cap, we're going to do this cap, which is exactly where we're headed under the current legislation, if we even get legislation. You may have seen the New York Times this Sunday, which talks about the 15 or so moderate Democrats from industrial Midwestern states who aren't so sure that this is the right time to move forward on a carbon management plan because it may hurt the economy. That's a political time decision because many of them are up for re-election when? 2010. So political time gets in the way once again. But the management of the carbon footprint must take place, and it must take place over time. And if you want something done over time, then passing a law subject to change every 2 years is not the way to do it. And finally, they can manage the big infrastructure decisions. An infrastructure decision that affects a region or that affects multiple states can be under the authority of the Fed. Creating that Fed is not a simple proposition, which gets me to my 6th and final solution. And that is, I do not expect in the next decade our elected officials to jump up and say, let's do a Fed for energy. Let's do a FERB, a Federal Energy Resources Board, because it takes away their prerogative. It is a sacrifice that would need to be made. And it's my experience, maybe it's yours, that the only way our federal elected representatives change their minds is based on what? Based on what their constituents ask them to do. So the 6th solution is a nationwide grassroots movement for energy solutions. A nationwide grassroots movement where everybody from Joe Sixpack to community leaders, to the mothers, the grandmothers, the fathers, the grandfathers, the sons and daughters of this country say, we've had enough. We're pretty good at that as a people. We solved the civil rights problem from grassroots up. Our elected officials couldn't deal with civil rights. It was the grassroots of America, the people marching on the streets, that made civil rights happen in this country. It was the people who changed the attitude and outlook on the Vietnam War. It was the people who changed the outlook and the attitude on the environmental movement. And it was the people who got sick and tired of the Iraq War, and enough was enough. And my view is, with respect to energy and the environment, the American people need to come to the point where they say, enough is enough. $4 or $5 gasoline, enough is enough. This battle over the air we breathe, enough is enough. Get on with it. And the way to get on with it is grassroots America saying we need the kind of change in the energy and environmental space that will assure our economic futures, that will deliver the lifestyles that we're accustomed to, and that will assure our national security for decades and decades to come. There's no shortage of energy. I hope everybody can get that. With all of the energy supplies that are out there, there is no shortage of energy. There's only a shortage of policy that enables that energy to be freed up at affordable prices and at the same time manage our atmospheric abuse. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John. We now have time for questions. There are microphones located in 4 locations, one here, one up there, one here, and one here. So let me just start right here. Now, let me remind you what the characteristics of a good question at the Kennedy School are. Those of you who've been here before may want to recite along with me. A good question, A, starts with you identifying yourself. Second, it involves one very short thought. And third, it ends with a question mark. With those, let me start right here.
I didn't quite catch who this federal agency would be accountable to. Are you suggesting they would be accountable to the people, or would it be under the branch of the executive? Wouldn't it still get into politics? Because people change their minds all the time.
The accountability would ultimately be to the president who appoints the governors, because they would either be appointed or reappointed under what the president would expect of a governor, with the advice and consent of the Senate. But they would also be under enormous social pressure of the electorate. Because if, in fact, they were not delivering, and the energy volatility and the energy costs continued to be unmanageable and unpredictable, the complaints would go to the president and to the Congress, and there would be demand for change.
Good.
Right up here.
My name is Andrew Alcord. I'm a sophomore at the college. You mentioned that hydrocarbons will be necessary in the future, just in terms of sustaining developmental goals, et cetera. But one thing I was wondering about is the solution seems to be primarily constituent and electoral based. We need that grassroots motivation. And something that I've noticed at the very least is that as gas prices fall, people are significantly less likely to have that grassroots motivation and really be asking for major reform or change. So how do we reconcile the fact that we will need hydrocarbons for development, but the negative impact that lower gas prices can actually have in terms of the demand for change?
One of the reasons that people, in my opinion, get so disturbed about the price is also the uncertainty that's behind why did that price happen that way. In other words, where did that $4 come from? And if the oil companies are blamed, then the issue is the oil companies. If the foreign imports are blamed, then the issue is foreign governments. And so that's one aspect of it. A second aspect is that under the proposal I'm making, you can have future alternatives that are being worked, such as a technology decision that could be made today is to commit the country to the elimination and the abandonment of the internal combustion engine by 2030 or 2035. And in the course of the next 25 years, build a hydrogen fuel cell infrastructure that would replace the internal combustion engine with hydrogen fuel cells. If there were alternatives on the horizon, I could assure you that the oil price would not go up very high, because the oil industry would continue to produce as much as they can, because that's what they do. They just produce as much as they can and get it on the market. And if the alternative was out there, that these internal combustion engines would disappear in the next 20 to 25 years, then you would have an affordable price for gasoline while you are replacing it with a different technology altogether. But it requires big decisions that are made many decades in advance to have such a changeover in the infrastructure.
Right up here.
Hi, my name is Ethan Waxman. I'm a freshman in the college. You say that businesses need predictability when it comes to long-term, especially energy businesses, with respect to future developments. But you also say that you recommend a cap-and-trade system over a carbon tax. Isn't that the problem with the cap-and-trade system, that you'll have large fluctuations in price with the economy?
I think that you will, for some period of time, have carbon price volatility until the industry gets going. But the way to provide predictability in that context is not to start pricing carbon through auction too soon. If a price of carbon is set arbitrarily, then I think you have massive uncertainty of what to do. If, on the other hand, there is a period of time in which carbon credits are granted to companies so they can experiment, play around with different ideas, see what is affordable and what's not affordable, while you later on introduce the auctioning of credits, then I think you can have a smoother start and you'll have more predictability.
Can I follow up?
No, thank you, sorry. Right there?
Shaloha. My name is Ari Cole, and I'm an alum from the Kennedy School class of 2008 and a physician from Honolulu, Hawaii. I wanted to say thank you so much for your leadership. I love your fuel in my Roadster. It makes it really run very efficient. My question has to do with my history here in Massachusetts. I grew up part of my life in Concord, Massachusetts, and we have a very old landfill with lots of degrading carbon material there over 7 to 8 to 9 decades. And I've been reading a lot about green energy. What do you think is the future towards using the massive number of landfills in our country to produce methane, which is a carbon fuel that could be used in cars and homes? It doesn't seem like there's a lot of technology in that, but it's very green, and we have an abundance, a plethora of landfills that could be drilled, baby, drill, and this Republican wants that drilled.
Well, thank you. I think there is huge opportunity in landfills, not only for methane, but for biofuel production. So all of the waste, the carbon-based waste, under the right conditions, where biofuel still plays a role, as long as we have internal combustion engines, there's an opportunity to both use the methane and the biofuel. But you need an infrastructure to do that. You need incentives or tax incentives of one type or another to be able to make that happen. And that requires local neighborhoods being willing to accept the infrastructure. So again, it takes a community of interest to be able to get it done.
Let me take the prerogative of the chair to ask my own question. You started out in your conversation talking about the fact that President Nixon talked about energy independence as a goal. 7 presidents later, not only are we not there, we're much worse off. I'm not sure we haven't gotten worse off with every president. Why should I be in favor of energy independence? It's a global market. We got global energy supplies, of which the United States will never be a huge fraction. Global energy demand, even if we had independence, wouldn't we still be subject to the same global markets? And why is that an appropriate goal versus many of the other things you talk about, which are independent of independence?
Good question. I think energy independence is a political rhetoric because I can't imagine it other than as an outcome. In other words, 100 years from now, if we made all the right choices and we supplied our electricity needs from nuclear plants and we supplied our transportation needs from hydrogen fuel cells, where the hydrogen comes from water that is electrolyzed by energy from nuclear plants, which produces no CO2, then you have a CO2-free society. You take the risks of nuclear fuel disposal, you take the risks of the water vapor that goes into the atmosphere from hydrogen fuel cells, but it's a whole lot less risk, in my judgment, than the carbon waste that goes into the greenhouse gases that go into the current atmosphere. And so you could have an outcome of energy independence, but I think to have a goal of energy independence really sends a wrong message to the American people. Why should we not accept Mexican oil? Why should we not accept Canadian gas? We're on the same continent. We should exchange what makes sense. So energy independence is really, I think, political rhetoric that doesn't get us anywhere.
Right here.
Hi, I'm Jack Gage. I'm a senior at the college. The Federal Reserve has a relatively independent way of affecting the market through buying and selling bonds. How would you propose insulating a Federal Energy Resources Board from political economy problems and from lobbyists, so say clean coal doesn't get a stranglehold on it?
Well, I think it depends on who you appoint as governors. And I think what you would definitely need is a more diverse board when it comes to energy and the environment than the diversity that we see on the Fed. The Fed is a whole different institution. I don't want to, it's sometimes wrong to compare the two. I'm only comparing them in the sense that an independent regulatory agency regime already exists in one core area of our economy, and it's worked for 95 years. But I think the board would need to be diverse. You would need a collection of subject matter experts that include consumer interests, environmental interests, and energy interests, so that they, in their own responsibilities, would come to solutions through the expert knowledge that they would have. There will be the pressure of politics. Anybody that thinks Ben Bernanke isn't pressured by the current political situation should guess again. He is. He's insulated from it, but on the other hand, he's part of it. And so these people would also be part of it, but they're insulated in terms of the next election or the next president's election. And that insulation gives them the freedom to make what I would call hard choices. We're very good at making easy choices in the political world. We have a very difficult time making hard choices. That's what that board would do.
Thank you.
Right up here.
Hi, Mr. Hoffmeister. Jamie Hannon, local Cambridge resident. Can you speak briefly about peak oil theory, why it's not really touched by the oil industry as a whole, and wouldn't talking about it more help us plan for the future a little bit better?
I do think that we will reach peak oil at some point because we won't want it anymore, but not because there isn't more to be had. If you look at all the resource basins around the world, including conventional and unconventional, we'll never use it all. There's so much there. Just in this continent, in North America, there are more than 1 trillion barrels of oil sands oil in Canada, more than 1 trillion barrels of oil shale locked in Colorado, Utah, and Wyoming. And in Venezuela, another 1 trillion of what's called heavy oil. That's 3 trillion barrels just in this hemisphere. And I don't think we'll ever get to use it because we will prefer other alternatives. With conventional oil, we would peak conventional oil sooner because of it's easy to get, it's inexpensive relative to the heavy oil or the unconventional oil, but I don't think we will ever run out of oil. We will simply make other choices, like the one I'm advocating with respect to the internal combustion engine. Sure. Thank you.
Right here.
Yeah, my name is Henry Daher. I work in the energy industry. My question is, if we look at the federal money that's poured into the R&D for energy technologies, we find it's dismal. So do you advocate increasing of this money, and could advances in R&D and technologies bring a solution to the energy problem in the US? I mean, we could have cheaper solar cells. And second, I heard you many times speaking about fuel cell infrastructure in the US, building that. Don't you think that the big energy companies, I mean, Shells of the world or Exxons of the world, are going to fight that infrastructure to the tooth of a nail in DC because it's going to threaten their existing infrastructure that has been there for 100 years? Thank you.
I think in terms of the first question on R&D, at the Hydrogen Technology Advisory Committee meeting last November before the election, I asked one of the senior civil servants at the Department of Energy, who would you like to see as your next energy secretary? And this civil servant said very quickly, someone with a technical background, because we haven't had a technical leader in the DOE for many, many years. They got Stephen Chu. No one better with a technical background than Stephen Chu, a Nobel laureate. And I think the stimulus plan virtually doubles the amount of money that the Department of Energy will have for research and development. So yes, the answer to your first question is we need more R&D. I think with respect to will the big oil companies resist hydrogen, probably not. they won't invest in it unless they're compelled to, but I don't think they would resist it. One of the things that people don't know about oil companies is they're very good at doing what they're told to do. They're energy suppliers. If they know what the rules are, they just follow the rules. You may see them as always protesting. They may protest some new rules, but once the rule is written, they follow it. And so if the new rule, if the Federal Energy Resources Board says we want a hydrogen infrastructure, and we want them located in current retail sites because we know how to manage energy in retail sites very well as a nation, then they'd figure out how to make it happen. They'd look for an incentive. They'd look for some kind of tax relief on the investments that would be needed, or the people that own the stations would. But I think it's a quite doable proposition.
Okay, thank you. I have follow-up, but maybe later.
Okay, I'm just going to take the three people that are left standing here, and we'll start right here.
Hi, my name is Stephanie Lewis. I'm a sophomore at the college, and I was wondering how your grassroots campaign would address the disparity between citizen knowledge about congressional structure and what you know, and how would you appeal to them?
One of the lessons learned in dealing with 15,000 people in town halls is how intelligent the American people are and how practical they are, and how the energy industry has failed miserably to communicate with them for a very long time, probably forever, and how many Americans don't know what their political leaders, either who they are or what they stand for. And I think it's a matter of conveying information in a way in which they can understand. So, for example, to talk about energy in terms of the four solutions that I mentioned first, that's a very understandable proposition. You don't have to get into subsea structures and seismic analysis and all of the other techno-speak that is really offensive to most American people because they think you're talking down to them. But if instead you're talking about what makes sense in their lives, they can respond very comfortably. So I think the education challenge is really conveying the messages in the understandable language which works at the street level of America. Whether it's low income, medium income, fixed income, I've met with them all around the nation. And when someone takes the time to listen and to explain, it works. And so the purpose of my own grassroots campaign will be to go where the people are in the voluntary associations in which they live, whether it's their churches, whether it's their unions, whether it's their PTAs or their Lions clubs or chambers of commerce, or their fire halls, go where they are. And they will listen and they will learn and they will respond, in my opinion.
Right up here.
Hi, I'm Megan Tybus. I'm a MPP student here at the Kennedy School. And it seems to me that affordable energy is a matter of perception, and that cheap energy in the United States has allowed us to become power hungry, while countries around the world have paid far more for their gasoline prices due to heavy taxation for years and years and years. So while it's clearly not politically feasible for the US to suddenly quadruple the gas tax or quadruple the price of gas by timesing the gas tax by 100, and I'm sure that's not something your grassroots campaign would really exactly want to advocate for in their own interest, I was wondering what you thought about the sort of general idea of increasing energy taxes as a way to move us away from the inefficient internal combustion engine as a policy idea.
That is one way, no question. And I've lived in Europe for 8 years and paid $8 a gallon equivalent for gasoline as a consumer. But Europe has done this over an extended period of time with sensible alternatives to personal mobility. So you can go to the airport on a train. You can go wherever you need to go on a train or a bus. So Europe has dealt with mobility through the mass transit system, which enables people to go where they choose to go, and in a convenient and a safe and a clean way. We don't have that alternative in this country. We have personal cars, and that's about it. Some major cities a century ago, made some investment in mass transit, which is still creaking along. But we have a long way to go in this country to get our heads around mobility other than the car. I can't speak for Boston, but I know in Houston, we just expanded a major thoroughfare to 7 lanes wide and we took out a rail track in order to do that. And so many elected officials were so proud to go to the grand opening of this extension of the freeway. And you got 14 lanes, which will all be a parking lot one day, and one day soon, rather than take that rail line and turn it into light rail. I think the reason I choose the word affordable energy is it is a relative term. And affordable is a matter of perception, as you correctly point out. I don't advocate cheap energy, because cheap energy is a myth. And we do have countries around the world that charge. We also have countries around the world that subsidize energy. And so I think what we need to do, instead of focusing solely on the price, is to focus on the solutions. The solutions will ultimately result in a price which I believe will be affordable in the way in which our food is affordable. And there may be some low-income or fixed-income people who may need a little help with their energy bill, where LIHEAP is only one example, but credits or other ways in which we deal with that. But the notion of artificially manufacturing a shortage of energy, which we've done in this country, which has prompted excessively high prices, as we saw a year ago, that's not good public policy. It's really the short, the medium, the long-term plan, which a Federal Energy Resources Board could play out over decades, that I think would make the difference.
Last question.
Thank you. Goedenavond, meneer Hofmeister. I'm speaking Dutch now because you live there in The Hague. My name is Willem Ledeboer. I'm a consultant here. I went to Delft and then to MIT. And my question is following. You talked a lot about the political difficulties here in the United States. And that is very difficult, and I appreciate that. But of course, it gets a little more difficult if you do this internationally. I think you have a whole set of other problems. I haven't heard much of your solution to see if we can do anything internationally. It sounds to me as if we can't do very much more than see what will be the lowest price for energy, and that might be a general consensus that can be accepted, but price and politics and so on are very intermixed, and it's not easy to see how that goes. Is there something that you can say about it?
I do believe firmly that American leadership in the solution of energy futures will guide the world. What works here will, I think, be adopted elsewhere. The fact of the matter is, thus far, nothing has worked here. We're worse off than we were 30 years ago. So nobody's going to look at the U.S. as an example of how to move forward, unless we get a plan and execute that plan over decades, which shows a better way forward in terms of the technology, the carbon footprint, the supply side, and the environmental management side simultaneously. I think if others see us have a successful model, they will follow. Currently, quite frankly, when it comes to energy, there are better models. Europe has a better model than we have right now when it comes to energy and environment. I think China has a model that gets things done. We may not like the outcome, but it gets things done. Our model is an inoperative and an unsustainable model, but I think that's what I'm advocating change. And I think the world will follow if we're successful. Thank you.
Any final remarks?
Just a final word, ladies and gentlemen. I do thank you again for the opportunity to be here. I do hope you take away the most important message of all, which is we can, as a society, deal with social justice, economic certainty, and energy affordability and availability all at the same time. I do fear that over the course of the next 10 years, if we stay on the current course, we could find ourselves with price spikes that makes last year look mild. Because 25% of the world's energy is consumed in this country by 5% of the people. But if some large number of our population see themselves excluded from sharing in the availability or affordability of energy, we will have a social response to that, and I don't think it will be pleasant. So I think this is important, and I do think the next decade is critical in getting this right. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Thank you, John Hofmeister, and thank you to Malcolm Weiner. Have a good evening. Thank you. Thank you. So we'll have a brief reception upstairs.
Okay. Great, good.